What do you see as some of the key dependencies or risks associated with, and we talked about a lot of the advantages in this era of getting to market faster, you're getting to market more globally right out of the get-go, but certainly you have the Amazon outage a week ago. I mean, Google Mail lost 2% of their mail for about a week. Turned out some backup tapes were kind of had to be brought back online, and then the 2% of people had their email back. So, I mean, what are some of the dependencies and risks you see associated with this new era?
They're everywhere. I mean, we have a level of interdependency now that didn't exist. I'd say the difference in the internet web era, if you will, which is obviously still happening, is you had a tremendous amount of codependency. You had a lot of adjacencies. You relied on other partners and other resources, as you're describing, JP. But now, when you have mobile and mobile apps and that entire environment, it takes you to a whole new level of interdependency where you literally can't exist. But I mean, the very nature of offering these platforms and these apps and components could not exist without the cloud, without the range of services that you can rely on most of the time. So without it, you don't exist. With it, you have risk. You have risk to your customers and consumers. You have risk as a it's not optional. It's not really a valid alternative to say, well, I was so upset that Amazon went down, and gee, I've had that experience before. I'm going to get off the cloud, right? Well, that's not going to happen, right? It
doesn't compute.
It doesn't compute. As we say in Texas, that dog don't hunt. Right, it just doesn't work. But that doesn't take the risks away. So you have to think that much more cleverly about where and how do you build sort of the old model of fault tolerance. Can you cut across multiple different providers of cloud services so that you can have essentially a failover in the back end? I'll actually say, great discussion on last panel about native apps versus web extensible apps. There's an advantage in native apps when you have something that works if the cloud is down, depending on the nature of the app. You can still have activity going on, even if it's for microseconds or minutes or possibly hours. Now, even we're in a very connected world. So the interdependencies are huge. They're not going away. They're going to get even bigger. And it's not a matter of thinking about how to stay away from them, but how to plan for those.
Right.
And the pace of innovation, I mean, if you look at how fast the cloud's advanced over even the past year, the pace of innovation, we're going to solve all these problems too. And it's going to be a lot of companies that are out on the edge facing some of these outages. They're not catastrophic. You certainly say, okay, now all of a sudden you see articles published about how Amazon Web Services in their cloud actually works, and the layout and where the redundancies are and where they're not. And how you can really get stuck, and then it starts to beg the question: do we go with multiple cloud providers and have a failover that way? Because Amazon architecturally doesn't let me do that today, and that comes into play. But you will see the innovation happen fast enough for those of us that are out there. The benefits way too high.
Yeah, in the meantime, make sure you really look carefully at the master services agreement and the service level. You're not on the hook for taking the risk when you don't really have control of it.
But versus earlier waves, I mean, the quality level overall and the relative level of risk versus what you have available to you with today's level of interdependencies is vastly superior. And as Brian said, it's evolving at such a rate that you can, again, you can't turn a blind eye towards it, but you can make assumptions that some of these problems will be, for all practical purposes, solved. So you don't have to build your entire business around this is the way it's always going to be.
Yeah, it's actually disruptive. It's such a leap.
But disruption, earthquakes are disruptive. Tornadoes, are disruptive. I mean, disruption is part of, figuring out how to get through work, life, and play at every level. This is just, it's one more level.
Right. I meant in the Clayton Christensen kind of way, in a good way.
No, that's right. This is the positive element.
Right.
That's right.
Exactly. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
So, other than extending existing apps, enterprise apps like Salesforce or SAP to mobile, what original enterprise mobile apps do you see evolving specifically that will be revenue generators for the developers?
That's a great question. I think that we're...
Can you restate it?
Yeah, the question really is, other than extending existing web services and apps out from the enterprise, what original categories of apps can app developers look at as being revenue generating for the enterprise? So I'd say a couple things. One is rethink what definition of revenue generating is. There's different models. So there's apps that companies will pay you to develop the app specifically for them on a services or consulting basis. There's apps that you can put out into the marketplace that will have value to an enterprise and or its customers, or maybe it's an add-on, like examples of add-on to Gmail and add-on to other. But what about add-on to, we've talked a lot about shipping and logistics and freight. What about add-ons to freight services that can be available as apps in a marketplace, right? So there's a model there. And I think the other element is thinking about how you develop apps that can hit as broad an audience as you possibly can in different flavors, slight variations off of it. Because if you go really narrow and deep for a specific app, you're going to have to get a lot of money for it. And that can be challenging, right? So if you design apps that have broad ranges of capabilities, and maybe you bring them out to the marketplace with, as Brian mentioned, 30 or 40 or 100 different persona, same basic underlying app, slightly different twist and capabilities in different persona or audiences, you can really have the advantage of scale while still having low cost to the consumer for doing that. And the last point I'd make is look for gaping holes. We're in this early phase. The next few years, there's going to be massive things overlooked by enterprises or just not handled well that are going to be gaping holes. You can say, well, I can't believe that I'm just pulling a name out of the blue, a UPS or a FedEx or this airline or somebody. I can't believe how bad this is. So app. Well, that may be an opportunity for you.
So are there some examples other than delivering packages that you can think of for the enterprise?
Well, I think there's not a giant example right now because we're very early into this. But I mean that doesn't mean there's not. There's thousands of small examples. And I think we're waiting to see those some of those develop into very large scale.
What would be 3 of those?
Well, 3 of those would be there's probably. I mean, think of how many travel apps have now native apps that you can use to pull from different airline reservation systems and do everything from check status to book add-on reservations and link in other services. So there's dozens of those. There's even native apps that you can get that will help you do cross shopping, across multiple platforms from one mobile app, and they're basically getting a transaction fee on those.
And actually, we're going to hear some really, one of the things that's different about this summit versus, say, a consumer-oriented is having the buyer's perspective. So these guys are tops of the game when it comes to really identifying opportunities. And next, we're going to bring up Pepsi and then Brocade. Pepsi will give you some other good examples. But there's a long tail here that's and it's still early.
Yeah, it is early, and we've seen Evernote mentioned as a good example, and that's one that really cuts across a personal use case, but you bring it into work, and many of us use it for work and for our life activities, and they make money off of a premium model, and that's just they're in the very early stages. We're even looking at their service as a way it integrates to one of our apps, which would allow people to use Evernote within our app and vice versa. And that starts bringing a commerce model into our app as well as for them into their app, and that's kind of scratching the surface. But the other thing to keep in mind is we're at the very early stages of the platform, so it's almost like you see with media shifts. What was the first television broadcast that looked like a radio show on with a face that you could see? And in the early stages of this, people really have not figured out exactly what the unique differentiating things that you can do differently on these particular devices and these apps. Not in business, I think we're at the early stages of that right now, very early stages, and we'll see some very innovative stuff, including entire companies that could be built around the whole idea of mobility and mobile apps with new business models. They're really business model companies enabled by this technology, and it might be the next generation FedEx or UPS or some other market segment, but people will imagine what you could do to create even a business around this new technology platform, let alone the apps themselves that will have monetization models.
Yeah, Steve will be back up to kick us off for lunch, and then over lunch, let's talk some more about other examples. So thank you very much,
Great,
Steve.
thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.